연변
혁명 통치를 위하여!
한국 어디
1971년 12월 27일 1971년 7월 1일
Can you believe it? A nation that now stands at the forefront of global technology and cultural influence once stood shoulder to shoulder with the poorest countries on earth. If we rewind to the 1960s, the data from the World Bank would leave you stunned. Back then, South Korea's gross domestic product barely reached $4 billion. To put that into perspective, it was only slightly higher than that of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a country thousands of miles away in Central Africa. Two names, one in East Asia, one in Central Africa. Yet they shared the same fate, poverty and stagnation. And then, the unthinkable happened. In just over 2 decades, that fragile economy launched into a breathtaking surge, reaching the $100 billion mark by 1985. But it didn't stop there. It took only another 21 years to cross the colossal threshold of $1 trillion. By 2018, the figure had climbed to $1.725 trillion, transforming South Korea into a true economic titan, leaving its former peers far behind. When you look at the glittering skyline of Seoul today, it's almost impossible to imagine that all of it rose from the ashes of brutal conflict. Beginning in 1910, the Korean peninsula was forced under Japanese rule, a control that lasted until 1945. Yet peace barely had time to breathe before tragedy struck again. The peninsula was divided north and south, split apart by the geopolitical calculations of global powers. In 1950, gunfire erupted once more. The Korean War tore through the land with devastating ferocity, draining the peninsula of nearly everything it had left. When the smoke finally cleared in 1953, what remained was devastation. By 1961, per capita income stood at a mere $94. A heartbreaking figure so low that even some of the poorest African nations at the time looked on with sympathy. Families struggled to survive from one meal to the next. Harsh winters were endured with foreign food aid and makeshift grain mixtures that barely kept hunger at bay. This was an agrarian nation lacking nearly everything: modern science, industrial capacity, even basic equipment. Inflation spiraled out of control. The prices of rice and cooking oil doubled within months. To the outside world, South Korea appeared fragile, exhausted, perhaps even doomed. Few believed it could survive, let alone thrive. So what miracle truly unfolded to reverse that destiny? To understand why South Korea's rise is called nothing short of a miracle, we have to confront the scars that never truly healed on this nation's body. It began in the darkest chapter of the last century, when the Korean peninsula was invaded by the Empire of Japan and subjected to 35 years of harsh colonial rule from 1910 until the end of World War II. Freedom seemed within reach in 1945 when Japan surrendered. But tragically, that moment marked the beginning of another painful era: division. Under the strategic calculations of global superpowers, the North fell under Soviet control, while the South was administered by the United States. The two sides failed to find common ground for reunification. As a result, in August 1948, the Republic of Korea was formally established in the South, while the North embarked on an entirely different path. But division was only the beginning of the suffering. In 1950, gunfire shattered the fragile peace. The North launched an invasion of the South, igniting one of the most devastating fratricidal wars in the nation's history, the Korean War. Backed by the United States and Allied forces, the South fought for survival in a brutal conflict that lasted 3 relentless years. The entire peninsula became a blood-soaked battlefield. When the guns finally fell silent in 1953, the cost was catastrophic: a shattered economy and a nation utterly exhausted. Imagine this: by 1961, South Korea's per capita income stood at just $94. An almost unimaginable figure, even lower than many African countries at the time. The most common sight on the streets and in rural villages was not prosperity, but hunger. Thin, weary people rushed through their days, struggling to secure their next meal. The harsh months between winter's bitter cold and spring's uncertainty became a recurring nightmare. Many families survived by skipping meals, relying on makeshift grain mixtures and limited food aid from the United States. Though South Korea was largely an agrarian country, agriculture itself was trapped in a dead end. Natural disasters, drought, and a severe shortage of machinery and modern techniques crippled production. As if that weren't enough, inflation began tightening its grip. Within just a few short months, rice prices soared by 60%, and cooking oil rose by more than 20%. The picture was bleak. Out of a population of roughly 26 million people, 2.5 million were unemployed, casting a heavy shadow over society and creating fertile ground for instability. South Korea looked like nothing more than a war-torn ruin, impoverished and drained to the core. The world viewed it with pity rather than hope. And yet, it was precisely from that devastation from a people standing at the very edge of survival that one of the greatest transformations in modern human history was about to begin. Even today, when the world looks at South Korea's prosperity, one name is spoken with equal parts reverence and unease: Park Chung-hee. He was a general. He was the third president of the Republic of Korea, and perhaps he remains the most controversial figure in the nation. As modern history, bold reformer who believed he could bend the destiny of an entire people with an uncompromising iron hand. In 1963, when he stepped onto the national stage to assume the presidency, Park Chung-hee did not promise an immediate paradise. Standing before thousands of students at Seoul National University, he delivered a blunt declaration. The Korean people would have to tighten their belts for at least 5 years. They would have to grit their teeth and work if they wanted to survive. His goals were crystal clear. Within 10 years, South Korea must lead East Asia. Within 20, it must rise as an economic powerhouse admired by the world. He openly admitted that many would disagree with him. But to him, the nation came before individual comfort. He was not there to flatter the public. He was there to impose austerity. He was prepared to die for that ideal. And Park Chung-hee meant every word. The moment he took power, he launched 3 simultaneous offensives: an anti-corruption purge, centralized economic planning, and a sweeping cleanup of the wealthy elite to sanitize the state apparatus. He made a shocking move, ordering the execution of 24 officials and businessmen for corruption. Many other wealthy merchants were arrested, but they were offered a deal: freedom in exchange for building companies that would serve the national economic blueprint drawn up by the government. For Park, the formula was simple: strengthen the economy first, democracy could wait. Under his rule, a system of near-total control took shape. Secret police were everywhere, extinguishing any spark of dissent. Anyone who spoke or acted against the government's will faced swift and severe punishment. The press was tightly censored. Protests were crushed before they could gather momentum. Few political leaders have ever commanded such overwhelming authority, instilling both respect and fear across an entire generation. South Korea had no natural resources. Park understood that human capital was the nation's greatest asset. He poured foreign aid into education, but attached harsh conditions. Students sent abroad were required to return home to serve the country. Those who attempted to stay overseas risked having their families back home face serious repercussions. Even tradition was not spared. In his drive for rapid modernization, Park was willing to dismantle what he deemed outdated. The Saemaul Undong to the New Village movement transformed the countryside. But in the process, many cultural heritages were torn down, dismissed as backward relics standing in the way of progress. He also forced the rise of massive family-controlled conglomerates, the Chaebols such as Samsung, Hyundai, and LG. These corporations were compelled to export at all costs. bringing precious foreign currency into the country and forging formidable global competitiveness. While the Chaebol extended their reach across the world, ordinary citizens endured severe hardship at home. Families were required to skip one meal per week. Imported cigarettes were banned. Coffee was prohibited. Even into the late 1970s, South Koreans were still watching black and white televisions. Color TVs were reserved for export. Luxury goods were tightly restricted to prevent capital from flowing abroad. It was iron discipline, a painful trade-off. A national sacrifice made in the name of a future superpower. To build an empire from nothing, when the soil held not a single drop of oil nor a vein of gold. Park Chung-hee understood that he possessed only one true resource: people. But to turn human effort into national power, he imposed an iron discipline so extreme that personal choice was almost erased. Modernization under his rule was not a matter of preference. It was an obligation. Imagine you are an outstanding student selected to study abroad. That opportunity was not a passport to freedom, it was a debt to the nation. Before setting foot overseas, you had to sign a binding pledge. You would return home to serve your country, whether you wished to or not. Should you decide to remain abroad in pursuit of a better life, your family back home would face severe consequences. The government held your loved one's future as collateral in exchange for your intellect. It was a harsh reality. Yet because of it, a powerful wave of elite knowledge flowed back into South Korea, laying the first technical foundations of what would later become an industrial powerhouse. The modernization campaign did not stop at human capital. It went straight for the roots of tradition itself, under the banner of eliminating backwardness. The Saemaul Undong to the New Village movements wept through rural communities like a storm. Cultural relics were demolished. Thatched roofs and centuries-old village structures were torn down simply because they were seen as obstacles to progress. Everything traditional had to give way to concrete and machinery. It was a painful severing from the past in order to race toward the future. Economically, a new game was established. Foreign companies wanted access to the Korean market. Fine, but the price was not just money, it was technology. They were required to share technical expertise with domestic firms. Through those openings, the family-run conglomerates known as Chaebol began to take shape. Samsung, Hyundai, LG, these global giants did not simply grow organically. They were nurtured and, at times, coerced by the state. They were pushed into a corner, export and bring foreign currency home, or collapse. Like octopuses, they extended their tentacles into every corner of the economy, drawing inspiration from Japan's industrial model to become colossal engines of revenue. Yet while the conglomerates expanded across the globe, ordinary citizens endured suffocating austerity at home. Every person was asked to skip one meal per week to conserve resources. Imported cigarettes were banned. Coffee was prohibited, luxuries deemed guilty of draining precious foreign exchange. Even more painful was this irony. Factories were producing color televisions in large quantities for export. But South Korean families continued watching black and white sets well into the late 1970s. Fashionable clothing, cosmetics, luxury cars, these were distant dreams, tightly restricted to prevent capital flight. An entire generation sacrificed. And the numbers do not lie. From a modest $32 million in total exports in 1960, South Korea's export value soared to $10 billion by 1977. It was a monumental achievement, but one built on sweat, tears, and absolute obedience under a discipline that left no room for weakness. To transform a destitute nation into a rising power, Park Chung-hee knew that domestic strength alone would never be enough. He needed powerful diplomatic leverage if it meant facing a storm of outrage from his own people. One of his most controversial, yet strategically decisive moves was the normalization of relations with Japan. Remember, the wounds of colonial rule were still raw. Public opposition was fierce. Many Koreans saw reconciliation as betrayal, but Park ignored the fury. he was not concerned with short-term criticism. What he wanted was to unlock trade and capital flows. The trade-off was immense. South Korea secured approximately $800 million in grants and low-interest loans, along with a massive influx of technology transfers. For nearly 2 decades, up to 60% of foreign technology entering South Korea came from Japan. Cheap domestic labor combined with Japanese capital and technical expertise created the conditions for a breathtaking surge of industrialization. At the same time, the United States became South Korea's most powerful backer. But the Koreans did not merely receive aid, they absorbed a system. The U.S. military trained South Korean officers not only in warfare, but in administration, planning, and organizational discipline. Engineers learned how to repair machinery and construct infrastructure from the smallest projects upward. Even Hyundai, which would later become a global giant, began by repairing vehicles for the U.S. Army. Park was also ruthlessly pragmatic in global politics. He integrated South Korea deeply into the American-led trade network and did not hesitate to deploy more than 925,000 South Korean troops to the Vietnam War. In return, Seoul secured lucrative economic contracts and substantial financial aid from Washington. This cold, calculated pragmatism ensured that money and technology continued flowing steadily into the peninsula. If one symbol captures the iron determination of this era, it would be the Seoul-Busan Expressway. When the idea was proposed in 1968, skepticism was overwhelming both domestically and internationally. The opposition party argued that South Korea lacked the expertise and equipment, and that the national treasury would be drained dry. Even the World Bank advised against the project. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development bluntly refused to finance it, fearing South Korea would go bankrupt. Yet Park pressed forward. Construction began on February 1, 1968. In just 29 astonishing months, the 416-kilometer highway connecting the nation's most critical economic centers was completed. The cost amounted to nearly 24% of the national budget at the Saemaul life-or-death gamble. But when the champagne was uncorked at its inauguration in 1971, South Korea had stepped decisively into modernity. The expressway would go on to carry around 80% of the country's traffic and generate more than 76% of its GDP. Park declared it a triumph forged by the blood, sweat, and determination of the Korean people, testament to the boundless strength of the nation. Through uncompromising reforms and relentless resolve, he pulled South Korea out of the shadows of poverty and turned it into a global export powerhouse in little more than 2 decades. The years of relentless austerity and iron discipline eventually bore fruit beyond imagination. When you look at the numbers, there is only one word that fits: spectacular. From a mere $32 million in exports in 1960, South Korea surged to $10 billion just 17 years later. During successive 5-year economic plans, annual growth averaged 8.3%, then leaped to 11.4%. These were figures so extraordinary that even Park and his own advisors had scarcely dared to dream of them. The peak came between 1986 and 1988, as the world itself was transforming. South Korea accelerated at a staggering 12% per year, becoming the fastest-growing economy on the planet at that time. And the transformation did not stop at factories or semiconductor chips. The Korean people began exporting culture. As the country opened its doors to the world, the government quickly recognized the immense potential of the entertainment industry. Films, television dramas, and music were no longer just creative works, they became economic engines. Korean culture evolved into a sweeping global wave, reshaping fashion, language, and pop culture across continents. By the end of 2011, a historic milestone was reached. South Korea's per capita income climbed to $31,750, officially surpassing the average of the European Union. From the ashes of 1953, the nation had truly transformed, like a dragon, to stand among the world's wealthiest countries. But history always carries a darker undertone. On October 26, 1979, the assassination of Park Chung-hee sent shockwaves through the nation and plunged it into political turmoil. The booming economy suddenly faltered. In 1980, the country faced a contraction of 6% and runaway inflation reaching 44%. Though South Korea would eventually recover with remarkable resilience, the shadows of rapid state-driven development began to emerge. Modern South Korea is not painted in pure shades of triumph. The Chaebols economic octopuses, once hailed as national champions, now account for roughly 44% of the country's GDP. Their dominance has become a structural burden. When giants like Samsung or Hyundai slow down, the entire economy feels the tremor. Small businesses and startups struggle to compete in a market heavily shaped by these titans. And perhaps the most painful price of prosperity is demographic. The intense pressures of modern life have made marriage and childbirth feel like luxuries. With its current trajectory, South Korea faces one of the fastest aging populations in the world. Some projections even warn of dramatic population decline over the coming centuries, threatening the nation's long-term vitality. South Korea conquered poverty through extraordinary willpower. But in the face of these new social challenges, can it once again create a miracle? If history has proven anything, it is this: a people forged in ashes do not surrender easily. And so, there is reason to believe that the Korean spirit, tested by hardship and disciplined by sacrifice, will find its way forward once more. Thank you for watching until the very end. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. I'll be glad to respond.